what we're going to do this morning is debate this motion, and we've got four wonderful speakers from a great background in methodology, thinking about trials, delivering trials, not just in surgery, but across all of healthcare. We're going to have a for and against speaker, and then we're going to have two patient representatives. We've got Sarah and Liz with us, who are going to, I'm not sure whether you're both going to or you're going to kind of wing it, I think. You're going to wing it. Perfect. You're going to wing it. So they're going to, because this is all about patients. This is all about what is it that we, as a community, can do to derive better evidence that assists in decision-making, that allows individual patients and groups of patients to better choose whether to have or not to have surgery, how to weigh up the risks and the benefits of such a decision, a really important decision. So what I can reveal is the Twitter vote that went out before the meeting, and the Twitter vote was, so this is like the exit poll. 63% agreed with the motion, 28% disagreed with the motion, and 9% were unsure. So, oh my goodness. So we're Twitter compatible, just about. So Twitter was 63, 28, 9, and we in this room are 67, so 68. Somebody's woken up. 69, 18, and 3. So still coming in. I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Richard Lilford, who is going to speak for the motion. Richard, thank you very much.
My job is to try and increase the vote for those who say that clinical trials are not always needed. Why, given that we all know that there's such a thing as selection bias, why might they not be needed? And the answer is when causality is not in doubt. So can any of you guess who the person is on the right-hand slide here? Louis Gansky. So the first heart transplants done in people in terminal care for heart failure. This is a picture of Louise Brown, the first IVF. I used to be a gynecologist, so I used that. So if somebody who's had both tubes removed, both fallopian tubes removed, has a baby after IVF, then there's no doubt that it was the procedure that brought that about. Of course, there may be subsidiary questions about the threshold for doing it or the method of doing it. I used to be editor of the Cochrane group, subfertility group. But as to the substantive question, can heart transplants save lives? Can IVF cause a baby? There wasn't one before. Then you don't have any doubt. In philosophical terms, in science, one is always trying to create a counterfactual. What would have happened to those people had they not had the intervention? And in this case, you don't need an RCT to provide that counterfactual, given although generally the RCT does provide the best counterfactual. So that's one reason why we don't need RCTs. Another situation where the situation can arise is when you've got a very asymmetrical choice. So I was once referred a young woman whose anatomy, his internal anatomy, was like this. She was born with no vagina, but with a uterus, very unusual. So when she had her first period, developed a hematometra, blood welled up inside the uterus. So the surgeon who saw her created a passage between the outside and the uterus, and the blood all came out, and she confessed herself content. But of course, you know from first principles, from theoretical reasoning of surgeons, what would happen? Of course, that tract is closed up. So what happened to her next menstruation? Well, she bled internally, but now there was access to germs, so she got hematopyometra. And that's what she referred to me, was a great amount of pus in her uterus and in her fallopian tubes. Very sick she was. I drained it all laparoscopically, but I then had to tell her that she needed a hysterectomy. But I had a friend, a plastic surgeon called David Sharp, who was an expert in tissue expansion, which he used for reconstruction of the breast after mastectomy. And I said to him, perhaps we could try this technique on her. I offered it to her as an experimental procedure. We did it, and now she is menstruating completely normally. So there was another case where a very asymmetrical choice. The formal logic here goes something like this. Imagine a situation where with no intervention, the person will survive for 3 months, for sure. and then will die. Or you can intervene with a very risky procedure, which might cause them to die at 50%. But if they live, they'll live for 2 years. If you worked out the expected utilities of these two, as he would do in the quali, it's much better in this case here than this. It's very hard to find equipoise in this kind of asymmetrical choice situation, as it would be for this particular person. What operation has he had? He's had a face transplant, hasn't he? And I don't think he would want to go into a randomized trial. The result is there for us all to see, and quite spectacular it is too. This is a slide I love. You could teach the whole of sociology almost from this slide. Does anyone know what kind of operation this person's about to receive? He's about to have a full frontal lobotomy by this chap Freeman, who used to practice it. So when the interventions are very bad, just a very bad idea, and Peter McCulloch said earlier on how important it was to have a well-framed intervention before you proceed to deliver it to patients. In this particular case, it makes a good illustration of the point that clinical research can tell you what objective to try to reach, how to reach an objective, but not which objective to reach. In this particular case, having the effects of a lobotomy is not an objective which can be traded off against whatever benefits the procedure might have. And then the last set of situations where clinical trials may be needed in theory, but not needed relative to other uses of trial resource, is when the trial just doesn't offer very good value for money. And this is a situation which can be modeled. I started modeling this kind of situation many, many years ago with my colleague Martin de Bono. This type of situation is particularly likely to arise in situations where for diagnostic testing, where first the diagnostic test has to prove positive, and then the treatment effect has to be found among those in whom it's proven come out positive. But the whole population that's screened forms a denominator. It's very difficult to get statistical power in such a situation. Not impossible. A paper was published only last week from Bristol with over 400,000 people in it on screening for prostate cancer. But prostate cancer is a common condition where that could be achieved. That is unusual across the whole of surgery. So in situations, incidentally, I've developed an equation which sort of proves that. I haven't got time to go through it now. So those are situations where trials are not needed. So, of course, when you can't do trials, there are other alternatives, not as good as trials, for sure, but there are other reasons. I've recently published a paper in the BMJ on something a trial I don't think could ever be done, which is removing or not removing ovaries at the time of a hysterectomy for benign disease. We showed in the study of well over 100,000 people that removing the ovaries was associated with an increased death rate, even though the risk of ovarian cancer is reduced by moving the ovaries, as theoretically you'd expect it to be. It's also worth noting in passing that meta-regressions or analyses of the results of RCTs when compared to observational studies are not as way out as some people claim. Of course, there are many spectacular examples, and I suspect the opponents of this motion will rain these down on you, observers, but there are many, despite the many examples, overall, the results of RCTs and properly adjusted observational studies are not as way out as all that. This study was published in the New Journal. There are sometimes, but not usually in surgery, alternatives to this kind of design, which we haven't got time to go into. And I suppose my last point is that theoretical reasoning isn't a sin, and in fact, it's an indispensable part of thinking about research. The black box attitude to randomized trials is passé, and we might have time to talk about that during questions. So I very much hope that you'll go along with the notion that clinical trials are not always needed. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm going to try and convince you that you should vote against this motion. And I'm going to pull people into my argument, starting no less than Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I would say randomized trials are the worst form of surgical evaluation except for all the others. So this is the common pattern for surgical innovation, and this has been published by Scott in the BMJ in the past, Where without evaluation, you have a promising idea, there's very rapid diffusion, very encouraging adoption, it becomes standard treatment, then we have doubts creeping in, and then it all falls away when your very old surgeons amaze their juniors with rollicking stories of what happened in the old days. And a little bit of that we heard yesterday. You could almost say vaginal mesh in this. So this is what currently happens, or what has been the history of what has happened in surgical interventions. And Mary Dixon Woods, who many of you will know, who's a professor of healthcare improvement, has commonly called this the ugly baby syndrome. So this is where you're always biased in favour of the ideas you develop. And you need to ask, we as surgeons, not me, but you as surgeons develop new procedures and are very, very tied to them. And we are always biased in favour of the ideas that we develop. And we need to ask routinely, does this idea, does this surgical procedure that I gave birth to really work? Or as Mary Dixon Woods would say, or is my baby ugly? We have to beware the conspiracy of enthusiasm, people who go out championing their own interventions. We need to be objective in how we evaluate this. And the only solution is to objectively evaluate your idea. And this baby looks very grumpy, and she was grumpy then, and you wouldn't mess with her today either, I can tell you that. So there's many ways to evaluate, but there's only one equal race in my point of view. All observational comparisons are not a fair test. All have systematic differences between groups that I, as a patient, would find very important to know about. The elephant in the room is called selection bias, and Richard mentioned this. And this is systematic differences between comparison groups. So we heard yesterday how, evaluating a new surgical procedure, I chose a good patient, not a patient that wasn't too fat and was very healthy. These are self-selected patients who go into the evaluation of early interventions. And this is not a fair comparison because then likely you will have beneficial outcomes for the new intervention. And the impact of this selection bias can be really substantial. These systematic differences, choosing better patients, highly selecting them, directly influences outcomes, and you can get a biased result. And there have been many techniques developed to adjust for this, and I see this as a fallacy of analysing out selection bias. There's increasingly sophisticated statistical methods to do it. There's matching, there's propensity matching, so on, there's modelling. All fall short in my view. And I'm going to describe this to you, not in highfalutin terms, but we are going to talk about laundry. Selection bias to me is the pink sock of evaluation laundry. That rogue element that you just can't get rid of. The red sock, the pink sock is there, and you just say, I really don't have time to remove it. I'm going to bang it all in, it'll be fine. So you shove it all in the washing machine and you get a pink mess. Then you try and colour remove it, but you never get a white shirt at the end of the day. It's a bit pink, it's a bit grey, and this is exactly what observational studies are about. You take all the data, doesn't matter if it's white or pink, you shove it in the machine, but propensity matching is my colour stain remover. It doesn't truly work. It works a bit, but you never know, are you going to have a blush pink or are you going to have a violent red shirt at the end of the day? So for me, the only solution to selection bias is remove it at source. You must remove that rogue stock out of your laundry if you want a truly pure comparison of what you're looking at. And to do that, you need to do an RCT. Why? What is so special about a randomised trial? This is set up to be a fair test. You equalise, everybody has an equal chance of getting one intervention or another. It's the most rigorous way to test new treatment. It minimises any of this unobserved bias. And it can lead, when it's been shown to lead, and Richard mentioned this, treatments thought to be beneficial originally turn out to be of minimal benefit or harmful. We are trying to get to that unbiased picture of do these interventions truly work or not. Just a couple of examples. Oxygen in myocardial infarction, thought it was great, trial done, not so good. We've had one from Andy and David, subacromial decompression for shoulder pain. Again, great mechanism, seemed reasonable, Placebo-controlled trials shows it's no more beneficial than placebo. We saw recently the Orbiter trial, same thing, commonly used procedure, applied in a randomised trial, not as good as we thought. And these are often driven by selection bias of these things. To me, there's another added benefit, and this is fairness for participants, fairness for the patients. Randomisation, where you have an equal chance of getting a new intervention or an old intervention, this protects the interests of patients. It guarantees that half are protected if that new treatment's found to be inferior. Going back to your lobectomy, I wouldn't want to be that patient. I'd want to have an equal chance of getting that duff treatment as well as having the good treatment. And then randomisation also equalises all the known and unknown characteristics. And we've seen it. Patients are very willing to join. They understand. I mean, we understand. I'm a patient. I understand the need to be able to evaluate in a fair way. They bring other benefits. It's been shown that they actually raise the overall standard of care because it's in a sort of regulatory framework. It also builds a community. So we've seen the example in the classic trial where surgeons provided a safe community where they could evaluate different techniques together. They also insist on ensuring rigour in data collection. And actually, sometimes the regulations around it can be helpful rather than a hindrance. There are perceived advantages, obviously, of observational data. Data from all patients count, clinicians happy to take part, you get large numbers very quickly, and you can look for side effects. And yeah, it does allow greater precision in estimation, absolutely true. But if you don't remove the selection bias, big data just allows you to more accurately estimate a potentially wrong answer. Is that what we want to do? There are lots of criticisms of RCTs. They're costly, they take a long time to complete, there's lots of regulation. But actually, these are man-made shackles around the idea of randomised trials. All of these are solvable together. We can actually, if we mobilise, we can reduce the costs, we can work together. The trainee collaboratives have shown us how to recruit quickly and at scale. Why can't we work and do this together? I think, as Vinny Prasad from Portland has said, you don't blame poor airline service on the Boeing engine that's actually inside it. There's nothing wrong with the RCT. It's all the stuff around it that we've put on that we need to move together. So I'm going to leave you with another thought. This is another quote from a very famous economist. It's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And I would say in surgery, it's better to be roughly right using the results of a randomised trial, the only true fair test, than to be precisely wrong using the results of other designs. So I would urge you, vote no.
I think in an ideal world, we would have trials for everything. And I actually think a lot of patients I come in contact with probably think we do. But we're not an ideal world. I appreciate that. So one of my things was going to be the cost and the speed. Now, I would need to be convinced, I think, how we could cope with the cost and the speed, because patients want innovation. They want the best possible treatment they can have, but they do want it to be safe. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the talk, but just because we didn't do them before, does that make it right that we shouldn't do them now? Historically, I don't know. So I'm interested in looking forward, and hopefully I'll be able to vote at the end, but I'm not completely convinced yet.
Brilliant.
So, hi, I'm Liz Philpots. I work with the Association of Medical Research Charities, so 140 organisations, patient organisations mainly, that fund medical research. So I'm kind of here, I'm a patient like everybody else is a patient, but actually it's more my experience of understanding what patient organisations and what patients are saying there. What they're saying is, we want research. We want research on real patients. The problem with RCTs, the exclusion criteria are so extreme that most patients can't be involved. You're designing a study which nobody can actually be recruited into. So that's my first point. The second point is, you mentioned earlier about patients wanting to be able to give them the evidence so they could choose. But they can only choose about a treatment if the outcomes are things that they care about. The outcomes that you choose for RCTs are clinical. They're not about patients' lives. And until RCTs have got strong patient-important outcomes which are used uniformly across the piece, then actually as a patient, I don't really care which one I have, because you're not answering my question of which is going to get me out of bed sooner, which is going to allow me to take my child to school, which is going to help me with my fatigue. Those are the things that you need to be thinking about. And the final thing about costs and who we're doing this for. Hands up, who thinks that you do an RCT to convince other doctors? I want you to put your hands up. I really want hands up. So none of you, so you don't publish. None of you publish, really? So really, that's the rest of you don't think you do RCTs for doctors. I don't believe you. Who thinks that you do it for patients? Really? Do patients read your papers? Do papers understand? Who thinks you do it for commissioners? Who commission the service, who pay for this new treatment? Unless you've got all those three people involved, as well as the clinicians, as well as the surgeons, as well as everybody else, how are you going to design a study that's going to be a new service, a new treatment, a new intervention that actually anyone's going to want to have and pay for? So, anyway, those are my thoughts.
That's set the cat among the pigeons, hasn't it? I hope you you could respond. So, just what we picked up there is what's this about? Is this about us and our careers and impact factor journals and promotions? What are we doing trials with outcomes that the patients really want? Patients want innovation. They want new stuff. They want to be treated better. But there is an understanding of the need for good evidence. So that was a really, really valuable and important interjection halfway through. So now we're going to do questions at the end up. So I'm going to move on now to David, who's going to speak against the motion.
There are 3 points I'd really like to emphasise from Marion's talk. And the first one is the selection bias. This is the huge issue. And we cannot get around it without having comparative studies, randomised controlled trials. Now, there are many registries in existence, and I'm thinking in my discipline in rectal cancer. So to put some flesh on the bones, there is a registry about the new way of doing rectal cancer surgery from the bottom up. And these registries are being reported, but they are not being truly capturing the important complications. So we are seeing rare but life-threatening complications coming through. One of the complications is a so-called air embolus. We've never seen it in any other type of laparoscopic surgery, but we're becoming acquainted with the fact that this occurs in this new technique. But it's not being captured in the big registries, and that is a real problem for me. And if we had a proper randomized controlled trial done with all the rigor and safety involved, then we would be capturing these very important complications. I think the second thing to emphasize is the indirect benefits of randomized controlled trials. So it's not just about that end result. It's very much about building communities, and Marion touched on the community building we experienced when we introduced the classic trial and laparoscopic surgery. So laparoscopic surgery was deemed a very risky procedure. You really didn't want to be the person out on his own, the maverick, doing this. But it provided a safe haven, a community, a responsible community, where you could undertake the innovation, and you knew it was being regulated as it went on. Similarly, in Roller, I described yesterday how it was instrumental in pushing up the standard of pathology reporting. So these are all secondary, but very, very important benefits. And you don't see them with the other techniques. You can have a registry, but you're not going to get those same indirect benefits, mainly because they're never quite funded to the same degree. I think the last point I'd like to make in my 5 minutes, though, is that there is a moral responsibility on us to do these evaluations with rigor and with care. Technologies coming through now are increasingly expensive, and it's very, very important that we get the right answers. So the randomized controlled trial for me remains the gold standard, and I'm very happy to vote no with Marion.
I wanted to remind us, why do we generate evidence in medicine? It's not about necessarily convincing our peers. It's not about convincing patients. It's about improving the quality of care. The care we deliver to patients need to be high quality and most efficient care possible. And there is this non-evidence-based conclusion that RCTs are the only way to do that. Because there's no evidence behind that statement. I think there's plenty of evidence for other ways of generating evidence as much as for RCTs. This is one important concept for us to also remember, that in today's surgical care, interventional care, we mostly deal with use of devices. They transform the way we practice care, and there are many of them. They proliferate. There are thousands of orthopedic implants available for joint replacement. Hundreds of different kinds of devices for various vascular interventions. And the numbers are growing. And all of these require investigations that simply are very hard to do through just one mechanism that is proven to be a good mechanism, but not sufficient mechanism for us to address so many questions we're facing. Another issue to keep in mind, when we are saying we need a lot of these trials, and the costs, of course, are highlighted. I think Marion said we can do them cheaper. But often we're dealing with innovators that are very small, and they've developed these two products at the workshops, at their own garages. And I think it's very hard for us to impose that level of scrutiny on them. And we have to think, is there a way for us to promote the innovation with some uncertainty, but make sure those good technologies that are out there we can clearly develop and adopt with not as much burden on healthcare system. This is the ideal D that we developed to guide the ideal process of accepting alternatives in today's reality, and particularly emphasizing the registry data as a way for us to improve the quality of care and nest investigations, whether it's early stage or trials, within this registry mechanism. That is right now one of the best ways we know is to improve the quality of care. I'm going to skip, we talked a lot about ideal D, but clearly helps us with the life cycle investigation of these technologies and surgeries, not just a snapshot at one time, I have this question and I have to get an answer. Because we do need to have a more dynamic way to think about evidence rather than I'm facing this question A or question B right now. Another important concept that developed by EBM group and GRADE group, we need to think about risk of bias in trials and non-trial based investigations. And when we think about possibility of risk of bias, we know that if you start off with the RCTs, you potentially, conceptually, at a high level of evidence. But what often happens, we see these kind of associations, or we know it's not physically impossible to do a high quality trial. If you can't do proper blinding, if you cannot do proper allocation concealment, if you can't design a study that takes advantage of proficiency of the surgeon or handle their biases even within the trial, then you basically cannot conduct that high quality investigation that were the gold standards developed by pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical settings. I negotiated 2 additional minutes with Jayne, so I'm going to go just slightly over. And in a similar way, you might start with observational and registry studies in the middle of the evidence, but if there are certain associations that you see that Richard highlighted, they don't necessarily need for us to do more comparative investigations at that rigor. And I think that can help us make decisions, more informed decisions under uncertainty. So this is international collaboration in orthopedics we established back in 2011. And I'm going to just finish with this comparison of RCTs and registries. These are all of the randomized trials that were done to look at the metal-on-metal question. This is our first systematic review of evidence of metal-on-metal versus any other bearing in joint replacement. We found only one study that showed difference between metal-on-metal and all other bearings, and that study showed benefits for metal-on-metal implants. If you combine this evidence, we'll come up with nothing. Everything is hunky-dory, the super good implants, and we should widely adopt them. And yet the reality is this. The registry from England and Wales, back on a publication in Lancet, Australian registry results, from studies from New Zealand, Italy, consistently showing that these implants get revised 40%, upwards of 40% of the time, and some of these implants 100% of the times. So I think we have to be more holistic in our approach. This is a study with ICOR, the International Consortium, where we looked at the same question and we found the time effect that most of the failures start 2 years after use of these metal-on-metal products. And I think that's another challenge for trials because the longer-term investigations are even more difficult with randomized studies.
As Liz put so far more eloquently than I can, because she's a professional, the quality of care of the patients is what it's all about. In an ideal world, I think everything would be studied in a trial, but I don't think that necessarily has to be an RCT now. I've come to realise that different situations, different devices, different procedures, they are all different, and perhaps different structures and different processes work. The ideal structure, framework, and the registry, to me, is something that if we're not going to do an RCT because it's not suitable, they have to be regulated so that the best possible outcome for patients, which is safe and can move on and give them the best possible treatment they can receive, is what we get.
Thank you.
As you probably can tell, I still think that we don't just need RCTs, we need other forms of evidence as well. RCTs are too expensive, they're too defined, and sometimes the evidence that it provides is so detailed and so high quality, it's not usable. So I want a pragmatic approach. But what I don't want is surgeons going off and saying, you know what, I think I'll do this today because that's what this patient needs, and that data's not being collected. So I think there's something about having a structure which allows the art of surgery, because it is an art, because when you come to an individual patient, what intervention you're going to do is about their anatomy and what needs to happen on that day. That data needs to be collected in some way. So if ideal is a structure in which that can happen, that sounds like a really positive thing to me.
Well, Marion and David, you've done it. You're the new Prime Minister of an RCT parallel universe. Congratulations. Thank you very much, everybody.